Good morning, it's good to see everybody. Today I'm delivering the 2020-21 biennial revenue estimate to policymakers to use during the 86th legislative session. This is one of the many duties of the Comptroller's office and is required under Article 3, Section 49A of the Texas Constitution. During the current biennium, economic growth in Texas accelerated and revenue collections were better than previously anticipated. This is why I released a revised revenue estimate back in July of last year. Since then, the economy and state revenues have continued to perform well. In the 12 months ending in November, Texas added 365,400 jobs, and its unemployment stood at an historic low of 3.7%. Strong baseline growth tracking a national economic expansion was bolstered by rising oil prices and booming oil and natural gas production in Texas. This led, of course, to robust severance tax collections, but also to double-digit year-over-year growth in our largest source of revenue, sales taxes. Collections of which finished fiscal 2018 10.5% ahead of fiscal 2017. Growth in tax revenue through the first quarter of fiscal 2019 remained solid. We expect continued growth for the remainder of this fiscal year, though at a more moderated rates closer to historical averages than the growth rates that we saw last year. Though the last year has seen economic and state revenue growths consistent with an economic boom, and while we project continued growth in the coming biennium, I believe that recent economic conditions warrants a more cautious revenue outlook for this coming biennium. After peaking at more than $75 per barrel in October, oil prices steadily declined and have dropped below $50 a barrel in December. Continued low prices or further declines could lead to reduced activity in the energy sector, which will affect not just severance tax collections, but other taxes as well, like the state sales and franchise taxes. Given that the BRE is a forecast for a period that does not conclude for 32 months, we historically note some uncertainty around the economic projections, and I think uncertainty is heightened right now. Interest rates have been rising, which could lead to reduced business investment, affecting economic growth and state revenue collections. Trade policy, which has a disproportionate impact on Texas as the nation's leading exporter, remains unsettled. The global economy has shown signs of slowing, which again can have an oversized impact on an export-heavy state such as Texas. Our projections for the next biennium are thus based on continued but slowing expansion of the Texas economy. For 2020-2021, we estimate state revenue available for general purpose spending will be $119.12 billion, as detailed in the first exhibit we have for you today. In addition to projected revenues available for 2020-21 biennium, this chart shows our revised estimates for 2018-19 biennium, which ends in August of this year. This table shows the basic math used to arrive at the amount of revenue available for general purpose spending. As you can see, we are projecting revenue available for general purpose spending to grow by 8.1% from 2018-19 to 2020-21. We expect $121.48 billion in general revenue related collections in 2020-21. That amount, we need to add a projected fiscal 2019 ending balance of nearly $4.18 billion in general related revenue funds. Keep in mind, however, that this projected balance will almost certainly be reduced by supplemental appropriations for the current biennium. We have then to deduct $6.34 billion in severance tax revenues that must be reserved for transfers to the Economic Stabilization Fund as well as to the Highway Fund. Starting in 2020-21 biennium, we must also set aside general revenue to cover a projected shortfall in the Texas Tomorrow Fund, the state's original prepaid tuition program. Because the Texas Tomorrow Fund contracts are constitutionally guaranteed, any shortfall must be paid by the state. And we expect that shortfall to be $211 million in the coming biennium. That leaves us with a projected $119.12 billion for general purpose spending, including federal funds and constitutionally dedicated funds that can only be spent for design purposes, designated purposes. We are projecting nearly $266 billion in all fund revenue for the 2020-21 biennium. The State Highway Fund, per the provisions of Proposition 7 approved by the Texas voters in 2015, will receive a maximum $2.5 billion allocation from sales tax collections in each for fiscal years 2019, 2020, and 2021. Starting in fiscal 2020, Prop 7 also provided that 35% of motor vehicle sales taxes above $5 billion in a given year would go to the State Highway Fund. The BRE, however, does not anticipate that motor vehicle sales taxes will reach the required threshold in either year of 2020 or 21 biennium. The next slide shows where our general revenue related comes from. Tax collections account for 88% of our projected GRR collections, and sales taxes after $5 billion is allocated to the State Highway Fund will make up more than half, or 54.5% of all GRR collections and 62% of GRR tax revenue. The next exhibit in our presentation shows the annual change in sales tax collections over the last 2 decades. Sales tax revenues typically grow from year to year. The average rate of the last 20 years is about 5%. But as you can see, some years deviate substantially from the average, with the annual change in this period ranging from a drop of 6.6% in 2010 to a gain of more than 12% in 2006. 5 times in the last 20 years, sales tax collections have declined from the previous year. On 4 other occasions, including fiscal 2018, they climbed by more than 10%. This kind of volatility is one reason we must be cautious in our outlook. Sales tax, as noted earlier, easily our largest source of revenue, and collections can swing substantially from one year to the next. As you can see from the next slide, our oil and natural gas production taxes, another major source of state revenue, are even more volatile with significantly wild swings from year to year. Over the last 2 decades, severance tax collections have grown an average of about 7% per year. But in no individual year has the annual change actually come close to that average. Instead, in every single year, our severance tax collections have shown double-digit % changes up or down, with collections dropping more than 50% in one year and increasing by as much as 83%. In fact, our best year in 2001 was immediately followed by our worst year. This volatility demonstrates the wisdom exhibited by legislators and voters in the 1980s when they approved the creation of the Economic Stabilization Fund and dedicated 75% of those revenues from oil and gas production taxes in excess of the 1987 collections. In November, we transferred from severance tax collections $1.38 billion each to the Economic Stabilization Fund as well as the State Highway Fund. We project $1.4 billion will be transferred to each fund in fiscal 2020 and another $1.46 billion to each fund in fiscal 2021. Without any further appropriations from the fund, the balance in the ESF will stand at a record of more than $15 billion by the end of the next biennium. That is far more revenue than legislators and voters in the late 1980s could have imagined would accumulate in the ESF. It is my hope that we can once again demonstrate foresight and wisdom by improving the way we manage the ESF. As noted earlier, oil and gas severance taxes are the most volatile taxes that Texas collects. Texans are extremely blessed that we do not rely heavily on these revenues to fund essential services in our state budget. As you can see from Exhibit 5, 5 states were downgraded in 2016 and 2017 as a result of their over-reliance on this volatile tax for ordinary budgeting purposes. Additionally, Exhibit 6 shows states that failed to address growing pension issues in a timely fashion face similar consequences over the last 5 years. Texas is thankfully not there yet. Relying too heavily on volatile revenue sources and failing to address pension issues has been a recipe for downgrades in recent years. When I entered this office 4 years ago, I was surprised to learn that my office is severely restricted in how we can manage billions of dollars sitting in the ESF. It is as though we are restricted to burying much of that money on the Capitol lawn. I have reviewed the best practices from around the nation, and it is abundantly clear that Texas must implement a more prudent and fiscally responsible practice in how we manage our Economic Stabilization Fund. It is vital that we ensure that we have strong ESF balances for a true rainy day, such as the next economic downturn. It is equally important that we take a much more thoughtful approach in addressing our long-term balance sheet issues that weigh on the state's balance sheet. By managing a portion of the ESF in the same manner as my office is charged to manage both the State Water Implementation Fund and the Tobacco Settlement Permanent Trust Fund, Texas could take significant steps in restoring these long-term problems rather than passing them off to future generations. Exhibit 7 shows how my office has grown the corpus of the Tobacco Settlement Permanent Trust Fund so it has retained its purchasing power over the last 15 years, while also distributing almost $1 billion during that time period to fund health care in our state's hospital system. Exhibit 8 shows that if we take a similar approach with a portion of the ESF, the potential projected annual additional revenues from this more prudent approach could put Texas on a path to address our pension problems in the coming years and could ultimately generate additional resources to tackle even more problems that weigh on our long-term balance sheet. As I have noted on many occasions, reform in the ESF through the creation of a Texas Legacy Fund could provide the legislature with an additional $125 million in the next biennium and billions of dollars in the cumulative distributions over the longer horizon to address these very critical issues. Now for the big picture and to wrap up. Texas remains economically well-positioned compared to other states, and we will continue to outpace the U.S. economy in the long term. The forecast for the upcoming biennium, however, is cloudy. The U.S. and the global economies are uncertain, and any slowdown will certainly affect Texas. And despite projected revenue growth, the legislature will again face some difficult choices in the upcoming budget. A substantial supplemental appropriations bill could take a large bite out of the projected ending balance for this biennium, thereby reducing revenues available for the next biennium. In addition to supplemental spending needs for the current fiscal year, the legislature also faces demands over the next 2 budget years above the normal budgetary growth tied to population and inflation growth. The most pressing and costly budget drivers for this session include a potentially large boost in special education spending, reducing property tax burdens, and reforming school finance. I stand ready to assist the 86th legislature, and I will, of course, update this revenue estimate if new data warrants an update. At this time, I'm happy to answer questions.